scenarios which explore how the choices made by government, business, and individuals impact the world. The so-called lens takes a look at how our future could look based on these choices and how we can make it better. With us tonight, Dr. Cho Kung, Chief Political Strategist at Shell's Strategy and Scenarios team. Dr. Cho, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Coco. Thanks for having me on the program.
Okay, so you have a team here that does forward planning or forward thinking at Shell to figure out what the future is going to look like. You've been at the team for almost 20 years now. How reliable are these scenarios that you build out?
Look, firstly, Coco, let's understand that we don't predict the future. I wish we could, but there is an Arab saying that those who predict the future, even if they get it right, are lying. What we do with scenarios is to set up a range of possibilities, possible futures that could eventuate. And we do that based on getting a range of different viewpoints of where we are today. Our understandings, there are many different understandings of where we are today, and unless we can understand what other people are thinking, we won't be able to assess what the different possibilities are. So our role is to set out different possible futures. We call them scenarios.
So when I read the book that is produced this year, I'm looking at 2030, 2050, 2100. I've never said that word in my life until I read the book 2100. And they're very different futures, obviously, from the present we have now. From the kinds of scenarios you built out 10, 20 years ago, what events did you see then that are beginning to happen now?
Yes, absolutely. Now, I think you need to understand that we look out very far ahead, not in order to be grand and to say, this is the future 100 years from now, but because we deal primarily with the global energy system. And energy transitions take a long time to work through. So you need to look that far out in order to see the big changes in global energy play out. Having said that, energy doesn't exist in isolation from all the other developments that we see around us in geopolitics, within the global economy, and so on. So I joined the team in the early 1990s when the big mantra was, of course, globalization. And I think the leitmotif of the work that we did at that time was to talk about, this was the 1990s, to talk about how globalization would play out. And I do believe we were one of the early ones to point to some of the difficulties that globalization would bring, social stresses, stresses in the workplace, geopolitical issues, economic concerns, increasing inequality, for instance, some of the issues which governments would have to grapple with. And for everyone, you remember that famous saying of Ronald Reagan, the 9 most feared words in the English language, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Well, we said that actually within globalization, government also has a role to play. So we always argue that there is this globalization mantra. In our 1995 scenarios, we call it Just Do It. But there's another scenario which talked about the role that governments would have to play to filter out globalizing forces for their peoples.
You mentioned geopolitics, and just over the weekend, the leaders of China and the U.S. met. And how is that going to play out? Because you spend a lot of time in the book, in the scenarios, talking about the relationship between China and the U.S.
China today is, I think, symptomatic or emblematic of the rising powers, the rise of Asia. In our global scenarios, we talk about that as one big shift that we see taking place, a shift from west to east. And it's a shift not only of economic power, that's how it began, but increasingly of geopolitical significance. And these transitions happen rarely in global history. But one thing we do say in the scenarios that we have 2 scenarios, by the way. We call them one mountains, we call the other one oceans. In our mountain scenario, we talk about competing nationalisms, and that is very much on show today. What we argue is that at turning points in history, countries at first confront each other, but eventually they learn, they will have to learn to get on with each other. It's like, living in your neighborhood and having your neighbors on one side and the other side as well. And they may have different views from yours, but you have to learn to get on, to accommodate other different points of view. And eventually, we argue that given the big issues that the world faces over the course of this century, issues of climate change, issues of resource stresses, issue of global demographics, countries will not just have to learn to accommodate each other, but will have to learn to cooperate and to work with each other to tackle these big problems.
Before the neighbors, whether they're neighbors on the streets or neighbors in the world, like the U.S. and China, learn to get along, how inevitable is it that there's going to be a conflict? You talk about, in your book, you talk about how China could have sharp elbows, and how while these two powers may have similar interests, they have very different values.
Yeah. So we talk about this process of accommodation in which countries retain sharp elbows in dealing with each other, but they learn also to recognize that they need to coexist. And we make no predictions. I've said that at the beginning. We set out possibilities, different possible paths forward. And within the scenarios, what we set out is a pathway in which countries learn. It's a learning story, the mountain story, a story of learning to get on with each other that's so important. And this plays out too in the energy implications of mountains when we're dealing with the climate problem and we stress the role of gas as the leading primary energy source sometime in the second half of this century. Gas will be critical because it has half the carbon intensity of coal. So to the extent that gas can replace coal, we are on our way to helping tackle the climate challenge.
And what's making gas so promising right now is all the shale discoveries in North America.
Absolutely.
And how is that going to change the picture, or even as far away as Asia? Or does it not affect us?
5-10 years ago, no one saw this coming. And then, of course, the shale revolution happened because a number of critical technologies came together, and with the right legislative, with the right investment incentives, companies were induced to go and get and explore for shale. And with the right investment incentives, this really is like turning on a tap. This really came on stream. In our scenarios, we assume that what we have seen in North America is a given. So that will happen because that is happening today. Shale gas and increasingly also shale oil. And the question we have for the future is, will this shale gas revolution in North America be replicated in other parts of the world, in Europe, and I think you mentioned this part of the world, Asia as well, and particularly I think everyone is looking to China, where the geologists say the potential for shale in geological terms is very promising, but of course it's a very different environment from what we saw in the US, because in the US, of course, many small independent companies went out to look for that shale, with government support, of course. In China, we got the big players coming in, so it will be a different process under a different set of circumstances. We are hopeful that eventually the resource shale will be developed in China, but it's a very different ball game, so we leave it open.
Very quickly, does that mean it happens faster here than it happened in North America?
Well, we have a very promising story for shale in our mountain scenario, a less promising one in oceans. So if you sum it up, you could say the mean is that it will happen, but maybe not quite as fast as in the North America case.
Dr. Cho, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Coco.
Thanks a lot. More news when we come back. Stay with us.